thank you for those very kind words. And you can hear me fine? Let me begin by, first of all, I want to thank my hosts at NYU Abu Dhabi for bringing me out here. This is my first visit to Abu Dhabi, really my first visit to this part of the world. So it's very much a learning experience for me, and I'm looking forward to learning what I can over the next week or so. And I also want to thank, in particular, the students who've come out to this tonight, and because I know there are many things you can be doing with your evenings rather than coming to public lectures. So I especially want to thank the students who are here and those who I met earlier this evening. My talk tonight maybe has a strange title, In Defense of Politics. So let me try to explain that. In 1962, an English political scientist and journalist by the name of Bernard Crick, best known today as the author of a biography of George Orwell, wrote a short and polemical manifesto called In Defense of Politics. By politics, Crick meant a distinctive form of human activity where conflicts among interests are adjudicated by discussion, persuasion, and debate rather than by force or fraud. A political society, properly so called, is one where individuals and groups play by certain agreed-upon rules that will determine how conflicts of interests will be decided. Crick called his book In Defense of Politics because he regarded the proper understanding of politics as being distorted by certain currents of thought and practice, such as the highly ideological style of politics found in the Soviet Union and its client states. Remember, this was written in 1962. The nationalist politics of the developing world, and even some aspects of modern conservatism, where this meant a kind of unreflective deference to tradition. Today, I believe it is necessary to reprise, but also to update, Crick's plea for a defense of politics. But what is politics, and why does it need defending? Politics is, perhaps to state the obvious, an activity. Its subject matter is human action. Now, all action aims at either preservation or change. When we seek to bring about change, we do so because we think it will make something better. When we seek to preserve, we do so to prevent something from becoming worse. Even a decision not to act at all is a kind of action. So it follows that all action presupposes some judgment of better or worse. But we cannot think about better or worse without at some point thinking about the good. When we act, we do so to advance some idea or opinion of the good. And when we act politically, we do so to advance some idea of the political good, or the common good. The term by which political philosophers have designated the common good has gone under various names, sometimes the good society, or the just society, or simply the best regime. The oldest and the most fundamental of all political questions is, what is the best regime? The concept of a regime is an ancient, but yet it is a familiar one. We often hear today about shaping regimes or changing regimes. But what exactly is a regime? How many kinds are there? How are they defined? What holds them together? And what causes them to fall apart? Is there a single best regime? The term goes back to Plato, but yet even before him. In fact, the title of the book we know simply as Plato's Republic is actually a translation of the Greek word politeia that means simply regime, or sometimes constitution. But it was above all Plato's student, Aristotle, who made the regime the central theme of the study of politics. Broadly speaking, the regime indicates a form of government, whether it is ruled by one, few, or many, or some mixture or combination of these basic ruling elements. The regime is defined in the first instance by how people are governed, how public offices are distributed, by election, by lot, by birth, by outstanding personal qualities, and so on, and what constitutes a people's rights and responsibilities. The political world also does not present an infinite variety of regime types. It is rather structured and ordered into a few basic categories: monarchies, aristocracies, democracies, tyrannies. This classification of regimes is one of the most important propositions of political science. But in the politics, Aristotle considered a variety of regimes and judiciously weighed the strengths and weakness of each. But still, there were two features that he believed distinguished the necessary conditions for any adequate conception of politics. The first of these conditions was that rule should be for the benefit of the governed. No polity worthy of the name should be made to suffer the self-interested rule of the one over the few, or the many over the one over the many, or of the many over the few. And the second feature of a desirable polity is the rule of law. Wherever there is law, Aristotle wrote, there is justice, in a sense. The rule of law may not guarantee justice, but of one thing Aristotle was certain: justice, and hence political legitimacy, was not possible outside of a framework of law. A government regulated by law and responsible to its citizens were the necessary minimal conditions for what we would call today constitutional government. There are a number of other features that may not be strictly required, but today have become inseparable from the functioning of a stable constitutional order. These are, in the first place, a social structure that makes possible a multitude of interests and consequently allows for an area of individual liberties. Secondly is the presence of an entrepreneurial middle class with the freedom to pursue its economic goals. And third is the presence of a class of persons with scientific interests and imagination that are today the engine of both technological and economic development. But there is a corollary to this insight about the regime. The regime is always something particular. It stands in a relation of opposition to other regime types, and as a consequence, the possibility of conflict, tension, and even war is built into the structure of politics. Regimes are necessarily partisan. Politics instills loyalties and passions in the same way that one may feel partisanship for, to take my local example, the New York Yankees over the Boston Red Sox, or would prefer Yale to Harvard. Regimes are partisan of this type. The passionate attachments are not merely something that takes place between different regimes, but within them, as different factions, parties, and groups with different loyalties and attachments contend for positions of power and interest. Today, it is the hope of many in various quarters that someday the basic structure of regime politics may be overcome and the world will be organized around global norms of justice and international law. Is such a hope possible? Is it desirable? It cannot be entirely ruled out, but such a world, that is to say, a world administered by international courts of law, by judges and judicial tribunals, would no longer be a political world. Politics, as we know it, is only possible within the structure of the regime. Now, the idea of politics as an activity concerned to curb and control conflicts within the territorial confines of a distinctive state or regime is today under attack from two powerful sources. As in most cases that I've found, it makes sense to examine politics through the lenses of Aristotle. Aristotle taught in his Nicomachean Ethics that all virtues, that is to say, all excellences of habit, of heart and mind, are best understood as a mean point, as a mean between a continuum of excess and deficiency. It is a matter of finding the proper balance between extremes. So it might be useful for us to think of politics in this light. On one extreme, with which we are all familiar, politics exhibits a kind of partisan zeal that holds absolute attachment to one's own way of life, one's country, one's cause, one's own in the broadest sense of the term, to be unconditionally good. This is the kind of loyalty expressed in famous sentiments like, my country, right or wrong. And the most powerful exponent of this kind of attitude was given by a German legal philosopher named Carl Schmitt, who wrote a brief and incendiary book called The Concept of the Political, originally published in 1927. Schmitt drew extensively on Thomas Hobbes, but rather than tying the state of war to a pre-political state of nature, as did Hobbes, Schmitt saw war and the constant preparation for war as the inescapable fact of political life. Man, he wrote, is the dangerous animal because he can kill. Individuals, but more importantly, groups, are in a state of virtual war with one another, or if not actual war, then preparation for it. Schmitt believed that Hobbes was right in one respect, but where he fell down was in believing that the social compact could create a sovereign that would put an end to war. In fact, for Schmitt, the inescapable political fact is the distinction between what he called friend and enemy, those who are with us, those who are against us. And rather than putting an end to war, the social contract actually intensifies that distinction. Friend and enemy are the inescapable categories through which we experience what Schmitt called the political. All humanitarian appeals, he believed, to concepts of human rights or free trade or democracy are attempts to evade the fundamental fact of conflict and the need for a politics of group solidarity to stand with others on our side. For Schmitt, only partisanship and war are real. Consensus and peace are phony. The politics of the future, he believed, would be determined by those who have the courage to recognize this fact and act upon it. And of course, when you remember this was written in Germany in 1927, you can see where such a line of thought was going. That's one end of the continuum. Let's consider the other that comes to light in the form of a kind of trans-political cosmopolitanism. And present-day cosmopolitanism would not be thinkable without the influence of another German thinker who came considerably before Schmitt, a man named Immanuel Kant. Kant stressed that our moral duties and obligations, in fact, respect no national boundaries whatever, or other parochial attachments such as race, class, or ethnicity. On his view, we owe no greater moral obligation or allegiance to fellow citizens than to any other members of our species. Citizenship, for Kant, is an arbitrary fact simply conferred through the accident of birth and confers no moral title whatsoever. But since birthright, you might say, for Kant, and I'll use somewhat different language than his, is an artifact of the genetic lottery, there can be no moral obligations to it attached to it. The Kantian emphasis on universality, that is to say that a moral law is one that can be universalized to hold for all human beings, however they may be situated, stressed that we were all members of a kingdom of ends, what he called a kingdom of ends, a common humanity where every individual is due equal moral value and respect simply because of their membership in that broad kingdom of ends alone. You can't think of a view more different from that of the one of Carl Schmitt. This idea for a cosmopolitan ethic of humanity, Kant hoped, could only be realized in a form of republican government, probably today what we would call democracy, a republican form of government, or to speak more precisely, in a confederation of republics overseen by international law. Kant was one of the first to propose a League of Nations that would, for the express purpose of putting an end to the war between states, for the sake of achieving perpetual peace. Only in a republic or in a league of republics would the biblical dream of peace among the nations finally be realized, and would individuals be able to treat one another as ends, not means. Kant's plan for an international league of states came to fruition a century later in Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points, elaborated shortly after World War I, and then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 at the inauguration of the United Nations. So you can see the transmission belt between Kant and modern international philosophy of internationalism. But what I want to suggest to you tonight is neither of the two views that I have just briefly sketched out capture the specificity of the political. Schmitt's view, let me start with him again, is rooted, to be sure, in an important truth. The world is a dangerous place. However, like Machiavelli and Hobbes before him, Schmitt takes the extreme situation, the situation of war and the mobilization of war, and tries to turn it into the normal situation, to turn it into the norm. An extreme situation is one where the very survival, the very independence of society is at stake. It is what we might call an existential condition. And for Schmitt, every situation is potentially a life and death situation where one must choose up sides between friends and enemies. Politics, on his account, is an endless struggle for power, guided exclusively by considerations of national interest. And yet, I want to suggest, a politics of unremitting war and preparation for war would have to be self-defeating, even on Schmitt's own terms. In other words, why would the struggle between friend and enemy remain exclusively an interstate rivalry? Why should war be something that takes place only between states and not within them, as the logic of bitter rivalry and partisanships cuts all the way down into the very fabric of our domestic affairs? In other words, the logic of Schmitt's argument points not only to wars between states, but ongoing civil wars, civil conflicts between rival groups within states. The result of such a logic of conflict would be, ironically, the negation of politics, that is to say, the destruction of the regime as the locus of organized political power. But if the effect of Schmitt's distinction between friend and enemy is to reduce politics to war, the effect of Kantian cosmopolitanism is to confuse it with morality. Kant and his modern-day followers, like John Rawls or Jürgen Habermas, hope to transcend the sovereign state and replace it with known international rules of justice. If for Schmitt, man is the dangerous animal, for Kant, man is the rule-following animal. But Kant's desire to transcend the state with an international forum of jurists is naive and anti-political. If, as Hobbes famously said, covenants without the sword are but words, who will enforce these international norms of justice? The Kantian idea of global justice is to wish a world without states, a world without borders, a world, in short, without politics. International bodies like the UN have been notoriously ineffective in curbing or restraining aggressive behavior. International courts like that at The Hague are often quick to condemn, but slow to act in bringing criminals to justice, and may do so in selective and arbitrary ways. Reliance on such bodies has the further disadvantage of uprooting peoples from their traditions, from their local arrangements that most people find as a source of reverence and inspiration. Nationalism and cosmopolitanism, as I want to call these two dispositions, are today the two doctrines or tendencies that tend most to obscure the true nature of the political. Each contains, at best, a part of the truth. The nationalist is correct to see that politics is a matter of the particular states, particular nations, particular peoples and traditions. For the nationalist, the particular, this people, this culture, this state, stands for something higher, nobler than the cosmopolitan ideal. We enter the world as members of a particular family, from a particular neighborhood, in a particular state, in a particular part of one's country. We are composites of particularities. And these attachments are not something extraneous to our identities. They are what make us who we are. The demand that we give up our particular identities and assume a new cosmopolitan identity would be the same thing as asking us to embrace Esperanto as the kind of universal language. Who, I want to ask, is the Shakespeare of Esperanto? Everything great derives from something rooted in particular. But yet, there is also truth in the cosmopolitan ideal. Are we condemned simply by the mere accident of birth to live by the traditions of the particular nation into which we happen to have been born? Doesn't this deny in us what is highest? That is to say, the capacity for choice. That is to say, again, to detach ourselves from our surroundings, to determine for ourselves how we will live and with whom and who we will be. The idea of choice seems to be at the bottom of our experience of human dignity. We experience our moral worth through our ability to choose how we will live and under what conditions. This kind of cosmopolitan ethic has the virtue of allowing us to stand imaginatively outside of our particular situations and to view ourselves, or at least to try to view ourselves, from a universal point of view, from the standpoint of what we might call the disinterested spectator. Clearly, such a morality, it is claimed, allows us to give ourselves a kind of critical distance or vantage point from which to judge ourselves and our society. From this point of view, our local and particular attachments to families, friends, fellow citizens, and the like carry, once again, no special moral weight. We must view them as we would view everything else, neutrally or from the moral point of view. That is the ethic of cosmopolitanism. Excuse me. Now, each of these two components, again, let me call them the national and the cosmopolitan ideal, has a place, but only a place in a properly constituted political regime. Let me consider for a moment the one regime that I know best, the American regime. In one respect, America seems to be the first truly modern nation, a nation founded, that is to say, on the principles of modern philosophy. Our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This principle of equality is further said to be the foundation for certain rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and from this it is said to follow that all legitimate government is based on the consent of the government, and when government fails to protect these rights, it may be overturned and begun anew. These principles were and are said to hold true, not for Americans alone, but for all human beings, always and everywhere. And far from suggesting a traditional form of communal morality, American politics seems to require commitment to the highest, most universal moral principles. This is the cosmopolitan dimension built into the very structure of the American regime. And yet at the same time, the American regime is more than a set of formal principles. It consists of the entire way of life, moral and religious practices, habits, customs, sentiments that make a people who they are. The regime constitutes, in Aristotle's sense, an ethos, that is to say, a distinctive character that nurtures distinctive human types. Every regime shapes a common human character with distinctive traits and qualities. The study of the regime is therefore in some part the study of the distinctive character types that constitute the citizen body. So to give you an example, when Tocqueville studied the American regime and democracy in America, he started first with the formal political institutions as enumerated in the Constitution, the separation of powers, division between state and federal authorities, and so on and so on. But then he went to look at such informal practices as American manners and morals, our tendency to form small civic associations, our religious life, as well as our peculiar moralism and tendency to bombastic forms of speech, something that he believed was very American, but part of the ethos of the democracy. All of these constitute for him the democratic ethos. And in this respect, the ethos describes the tone, the character or tone of a society, what it finds worthy of admiration, what it looks up to. This is all a way of saying that the study of the regime requires an appreciation not only for a set of abstract ideas, but for history and a distinctive way of life. A regime is more, once again, than a set of laws and institutions, but is embedded in a particular set of moral, legal, and political practices that give it color and distinguish it from all others. In Heideggerian language, an ethos is a people's way of being in the world, situating, once again, its rootedness in something particular. A proper understanding of the particular regime requires then an immersion in history, not just in the principles of the regime, but in its history. And by history, I mean not social, not economic, not even cultural history, but political history. Political history presupposes the centrality of politics, how the regime and its most fundamental laws shape the character and choices of its citizen body. So the proper study of politics, I want to suggest, requires both the skills of political philosophy and political history. Well, the political philosopher studies the principles, you might say the underlying principles or structures of the regime. The political historian examines the way in which those principles have been applied in practice. While the philosopher is concerned with the best regime, the regime, you might say, that is best according to unchanging principles, the historian is concerned with what is the best for particular peoples in particular circumstances: Athenians, Englishmen, Americans, Abu Dhabians. The greatest political historians, at least the ones known to me, Thucydides, Mommsen, Macaulay, Henry Adams, examine how different regimes both express but also depart from their own core values and principles. And finally, this raises the question of the relation between the best regime and actually existing regimes. What function does the best regime play in political studies? And how should it guide our actions in the here and now, given, again, what I said at the outset, that all action is in some sense guided by judgments of better or worse, and therefore, in some sense, presupposes a notion of the good or the best regime. How should that understanding, what role should it play in the study of politics, and how should it guide our actions? That issue received, again, a famous formulation in Aristotle's treatment of the difference between what he called the good human being and the good citizen. For the good citizen, you could say, patriotism is enough to uphold and defend the laws of your country simply because it is your own is both necessary and sufficient. Such a view of citizen virtue, however, runs into the obvious objection that the good citizen of one regime will not be exactly the same thing as the good citizen of another. But the good citizen for Aristotle was not the same thing as the good human being. Well, the good citizen is relative to his regime, regime-specific. The good human being is good everywhere. The good human being loves what is good simply, not simply because it is our own, but because it is good. Abraham Lincoln once said of an older contemporary of his named Henry Clay, he said he loved his country partly because it was his own country, but mainly because it was a free country. Clay exhibited here, at least on Lincoln's retelling, something of the philosopher. What he loved was an idea, the idea of freedom. And this was not the property of any one person or people, but of any good society anywhere. And this tension between the best regime and the actual regime a variant of the Aristotle's distinction between the good citizen and the good human being, is the space that makes the study of politics possible. In the best regime, if we lived in the best regime, political philosophy would become unnecessary or redundant. It would wither away. There would be no longer any need to speculate on the conditions of what is best. Political philosophy exists and can only exist in the zone of indeterminacy between the is and the ought, between the actual and the ideal. But this raises a host of questions for any thoughtful student of politics. Is the best regime possible? And if so, how will it be instituted? What type of regime is best under less than optimal circumstances? And how can it be brought closer to the best? What are the techniques of political reform by which existing regimes can be made more stable and coherent? These are questions best answered by political judgment or prudence, the form of knowledge governing political life, and that distinguishes the study of politics from all other arts. And this brings me to my final question of tonight's lecture. What is political judgment, and how can it be taught? The defense of politics today requires us to rethink the role of political education. What is such an education for? Man, as Aristotle said, may be the political animal, but this does not mean that politics is encoded in our DNA. Politics is an art, and like all arts, it must be taught. But teaching requires teachers, and where are such teachers to be found? Not, it appears, in many of our current academic departments. In my own field of political science, for example, a science that was once designated as the skill or art possessed by the statesman and citizen, civic education, or political education, has been replaced by something called game theory that regards politics as a marketplace where individual preferences are formed and utilities maximized. Rather than teaching students to thinking of themselves as citizens with certain obligations to their fellows, the new political science treats us as rational actors who exercise preferences. What should we have a preference for? How should those preferences be exercised? On these, the most fundamental question, our modern political science is silent. It has nothing to offer. By reducing all politics to choice and all choices to preferences, the new political science is forced to accord legitimacy to every preference, however base or indecent it might be. This kind of value neutrality is akin to the philosophic disposition known as nihilism, that is to say, the belief that our deepest matters of principle are nothing more than blind preferences. The very possibility of politics, you might even say its conditions of possibility, assume the primacy of political judgment. By judgment, I mean the art of practical reasoning, as practiced by members of a jury or a political assembly or of a civic association, anywhere where deliberation takes place. Politics is a practical art, precisely in the manner intended by thinkers like Aristotle and Tocqville. It is oriented not simply toward knowledge, but toward action, where action involves deliberation, foresight, and judgment. Political judgment entails know-how of the kind exhibited by the statesman. It is both, therefore, an intellectual as well as a moral quality. It requires knowledge of political facts, but it is not essentially empirical. Political judgment should be distinguished then both from technical know-how, for instance, the kind of expertise regarded for the production of manufactured items, but it also needs to be distinguished from theoretical knowledge, where this means the search for abstract, universal laws governing human behavior. Political judgment, by contrast to both of these, is knowledge of the fitting or the appropriate. It requires an attention to the nuances or particularities of a human situation. Such knowledge will always be provisional. It will always be true for the most part and will always admit of exceptions. And the person who possesses this kind of knowledge will have that special quality of insight or discrimination that distinguishes him or her from those of a purely theoretical cast of mind. The faculty of judgment is something that requires experience. It is not just a technique that can be learned by heart, repeated by rote, and applied mechanically. It is something like the capacity to learn a language, which we do not just through memorizing grammar and syntax, but from an immersion in the practice of the language itself. Political judgment is not, again, necessarily a matter of having more information or having access to a larger body of facts, as helpful as these might be, but is the ability to see something before others do, to know what to do and when to do it. It entails the capacity for synthesis as well as for analysis. It is the ability to adapt to new and often unforeseen situations, or in the old metaphor from Plato, it is a matter of keeping the ship of state afloat. Much of modern-day political science has neglected the role of political judgment precisely because it appears too arbitrary, too subjective, something that seems to resist or stand outside the realm of quantification. And in place of the faculty of judgment, our political science has stressed in its place a narrow-minded focus on methodology, often at the expense of the real life and death issues that make up the substance of politics. This attempt to turn politics into a science like physics, or to model it along some other social science like economics or psychology, is to lose sight of its original purpose. The purpose of political science was never to stand outside of or above the political community, as, for example, an entomologist observing ant behavior. But the study of politics was always intended to serve as a civic-minded guardian of disputes in order to restore peace and stability to conflict-ridden situations. So my question, as I begin to wind this up, is what should the study of the political be today? To ask a question once posed brilliantly by Karl Marx, who will educate the educators? How can we reintroduce the art of political judgment? And in fact, who is equipped to do so? The best answer that I can come up with, or that I've been able to come up with, is through the study of old books, often very old ones. These are our best teachers in a world where real teachers are in short supply. On any short list of such books, I would include front and center works like Aristotle's Politics, Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, the Federalist Papers, and Tocqueville's Democracy in America. To read these books in the spirit in which they were written is to acquire an education in political responsibility. But the works of our greatest political theorists need to be supplemented, particularly by the works of our most astute psychological novelists. A great novel contains instances of moral reasoning, persuasion, and deliberation that give life and meaning to the theories of the greatest philosophers. I mention only the names of Tolstoy, Henry Adams, Henry James, and of course, Jane Austen as the most obvious examples of this art. These, in turn, should be supplemented by the deeds and writings of the most important statesmen from around the world, from Pericles, Bismarck, and Disraeli to Lincoln and Churchill. Their works are a virtual education in statecraft and knowledge of how to negotiate affairs in times of crisis. Today, I mention this because the study of politics has become simply too important to be left to the political scientists. And on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Are you
Is
willing
the-
to
is
answer
the
questions?
preacher to take questions?
Sure, sure.
I'll be
we
happy.
do have time.
I'll be happy to if there are questions.
So if you could raise your hand and do wait for the mic before you start to speak, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smith. This is a really exciting lecture, one of the best I ever heard. My question is, what is, in your mind, what is the ideal political regime?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the hardest question of all. What is the ideal regime? I'm going to punt a little bit on that question. I'm not going to tell you what the ideal regime is, because I in many ways feel what I'm concerned here is to reshape or restore the idea of politics as a form of constitutional government. Is that the ideal of the kind I've described, a form of constitutional government, rule of law, that politics should be governed for some notion of the common interest? The question is that the best? Is that simply the best regime? What would the best regime look like? Would it be something like a kind of ideal monarchy of the kind that, say, Plato famously described in his Republic? Would it be a regime based upon the general will of the kind that Rousseau describes in the Social Contract? Or would it be closer to the idea of a kind of constitutional order that I've described that maybe finds expression in Locke or philosophers like Locke or the Federalist authors, something like that? I mean, that is the subject of my field. I don't know that I can tell you which of these is the best. I know which I think constitutes the condition, a somewhat lower standard. Let me say the conditions of political legitimacy, which is to say regimes that meet certain, again, sort of criteria of law-governedness and rule for the benefit of the common good. That I feel is a question that I can try to answer, and have tried to do so a bit here. Is it the best? I think that's for everybody to think about, and what I try to do in my show different alternatives to this in my classes and in some of my writings.
So, the mic's there, so we'll come down here. Please, go ahead.
Professor Smith, you mentioned value neutrality and the new, I guess, nihilism. You mentioned it. I wanted to know, in your opinion, why do you feel that value neutrality has actually gained popularity? And if we wanted to, I don't know, reverse or change this, how could we go about doing this? Thank you.
Great. Yes. Thanks a lot. I said this because it seems to me by by the new models of social science and political science that think of us, again, not fundamentally as citizens. They don't think of they don't think of us as bearers of certain right. What is it to be a citizen? It means to have certain rights and responsibilities vis-a-vis the regime of which you are a member. But rather just thinking of us in some way as abstract consumers with preferences, with preferences, but with no real view about what we should have a preference for. That suggestion of neutrality among preferences denies to the study of politics what I think is the most important lesson of politics, the ability to render judgments, to make judgments. Our judgments may be flawed, our judgments may be imperfect and partial, but to me, the purpose of the study, the very purpose of the study of politics, as I've tried to suggest, is to instill, to educate people, to render political judgments and to restore and to harmonize conflict-ridden situations. And our modern social science, which tells us, or wants to avoid judgment altogether, seems to me to, again, skirt close to, and I use a loaded term, I realize, or I use an inflammatory term, nihilism, which seems to me to deny that there can be any judgment of better and worse, but just sort of just accords a kind of equality to all, regardless of what they are. and how to restore that. I mean, I think that is something I struggle with all the time in my classes and in other things. And I think the best way to begin is first to read, to start reading. To read writers where judgment and the exercise of, again, a certain kind of practical deliberation over affairs is central, and that's why I include for my ideal syllabus of the study of politics not only great philosophers who think about political judgment, but also novelists and literary figures who don't really have theories about judgment, but where you actually can see reasoning, thinking, judging taking place in particular conflicts. This is why the study of politics, as it were, the core principles of politics, always needs to be supplemented by historical and I think literary studies to give them life and to give life to those basic principles, which alone can be often seemed rather dry and uninviting. It's only when you see our political world as not just voters exercising preferences, but where you see people actually engaged in deliberation over how they want to live, what kind of community, what kind of society they want to live in. That is to say, when you see our politics as animated by political ideas, then you can begin to restore, I think, to our study of politics what it was really intended to be about. But thanks very much for that question. I appreciate that.
Hello. You mentioned about different regimes,
Yeah.
and there is a thread that permeates through all different regimes if they are revived regimes in terms of a nation.
Mm-hmm.
That's in terms of there is transparency there is rule of law, they have a set of core values
Mm-hmm.
which they adhere to, they'll even shed their blood for these core values, and so therefore you'd see some sort of progress. You went on then to mention about a good citizen and how that is defined by the regime itself. The next point you mentioned about is a good human. Behavior in itself, or what good behavior is determined by the concepts and ideas that somebody carries.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore that actually defines what a good behavior is. So therefore you mentioned about cosmopolitanism,
Yeah.
and how in actual fact cosmopolitanism is actually embedded within secular
Right.
liberalism,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not embedded in any other regime there. And the discussion about regime seems to be it's all encapsulated or within the parameter of secular liberalism. You haven't actually gone out of that and discussed other things apart from that. So therefore, as an example, within America, child pornographic animation cartoons is seen as good in America, according to the Constitution and so forth. However, in other societies, it wouldn't be seen as
Right.
being good. So therefore, from the basis of what good is,
Right.
it actually needs to be defined. Thank you.
Right. Well, that's I'm not sure these things are regarded as good. They might be regarded as legally, in some respects, legally acceptable. And one of the distinctions made within a kind of liberal form of government is a distinction between the moral and the legal. Many things people do we look down upon, but that's not to say we regard them as illegal. And there are reasons for doing that. But tonight I did focus on, I think I tried to be, let me approach this in a couple of different ways. One of the things I've always, to go back to the thinker on politics from whom I've learned the most from, Aristotle. Aristotle showed a remarkable, in many ways, liberality in the very broadest sense of the term when discussing regimes. And one that I try to, in my own thinking, try to imitate. And what I mean by that is he's very slow. In fact, he's very deeply reluctant simply to condemn any regime out of hand. Every regime, he believes, seems to have some rationale for it. You might say living, centuries before the era of modern totalitarianism. For Aristotle, no regime was so bad that its preservation wasn't worth something. And therefore, in a lot of his writings, you see him offering advice to regimes, tyrannies, and so how to make themselves stable and more moderate. I try to do that. I don't think anything I've said has particularly ruled out many kinds of regimes, even non-secular kinds of societies. Again, so long as the societies are again ruled by law, and show that their policies and laws are undertaken for some idea of the common good. I do think there are other features that a regime today, as I've suggested, must exercise to qualify in some ways as a kind of modern constitutional state. I don't want to just repeat what I said, but I think a kind of diverse social structure that has many interests, multiple interests, and gives people the liberties to pursue them, kind of makes room for a sort of entrepreneurial middle class to pursue its own economic goals, the importance of science and creating a space for scientific imagination to express itself. These have all become parts of what we think of as constitutional democracy. But I think many regimes in the world today will satisfy the many, maybe not every one particular of those features. So I guess what I want to say is that I don't really feel I've adopted a standard of just, I don't want to, the term you used, I think, kind of secular democracy or something like that. I think I've tried to be a little more capacious in my look than that alone. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
I have a small question, and then maybe at least what I think of as maybe a larger one. The first small question is, while I appreciate your reading of contemporary political science, I wonder if what you're expressing is really a disciplinary distinction between political science and political philosophy. And if, in fact, description per se, as carried out by political scientists, is a bad thing to do, perhaps it's just the categories of description that are being deployed today that are relatively impoverished. And that's something that would be helpful for me if you could clarify. The larger question, which I think may be a slightly different version of the question the previous gentleman has just asked, has to do with how struck I was by your, what I see as a tension of some kind. I'm not sure how to characterize it, but a tension between the swift dismissal of cosmopolitanism and what I hesitate to call the parochialism of the reading list. And I guess I wonder what works of political philosophy outside of a few Northern Mediterranean or Northern European or North American traditions you have found valuable for thinking about politics in general, the good society, and these questions, because I think that the answer to this question may lie in part at the tension of the previous question, as well as my own concerns about cosmopolitanism versus parochialism.
Okay, let me take what I take to be two questions there. The first one, am I not simply describing political philosophy, what political philosophy should be read in political science? I would say as a descriptive matter, that is the way in which most of our departments, academic departments, think of this. Well, political philosophy that deals with the questions of what ought to be, the normative questions, the value questions. Political science deals with the facts on the ground, the causal questions, and so on. And we kind of divide it up that way. I mean, as a practical description of the way political science departments work. I think that's sort of described, but that's exactly what I don't like about it. I don't believe what I've described here, the kind of broad outline I've described, is something narrowly confined to the world of political philosophy. I think political philosophy is the central component of the discipline of political science, which is why I always refer to myself as a political scientist, because I regard what I do as central to the field of political science. The discipline's moved in ways, yes, I'm not altogether pleased with, partly because it does not take as seriously as I believe needs to be taken seriously the basic questions that I've been talking about today, which I think are part of everyone's education in the study, should be at least in the study of politics. So I am offering a program for I think we should revise our fundamental understandings of politics, that I think would have the function of bringing what we've come to think of as the normative and the empirical dimensions of the field in much closer kind of conversation with each other. So much for that. Let me address what your criticism of the parochialism of my reading list. First, I'd say I'd answer that in two ways. First of all, what I've suggested is only, I certainly don't mean this as it's only the beginning point of such a list. By no means intended as an exhaustive syllabus. And if you want an example of two figures from outside, let's call it the classical Western canon, that have been most important to me, I didn't include them here in my list, but the thinkers who I teach and who have been most important to me, it would be enough for me to mention the names of Maimonides and Al-Farabi to show that I think the very important ways in which issues of religion, politics, and philosophy have been studied in both the Islamic and the Jewish medieval world as kind of, again, a fundamental way of conceiving of politics. I don't know that, but that's certainly what I would include.
You okay with a couple?
Oh yeah,
two or three
sure.
more questions?
I'm happy to keep going if you like. Yeah.
Maybe you answered some of my questions but also regarding the when any political scientists talk about political science, they start with Aristotle and then to the modern Kant and also the what you've mentioned. Nothing has been mentioned about Ibn Khaldun, about maybe the Chinese. I think the Chinese I'm sure there is some political philosophers in China, and it seems like we are looking at the world from one perspective, and it's like a linear starting from Athena and then to the modern Europe and America, not considering other point of views. You know, in this world there was a culture, there was a long history of political state, and people believe that this might be the right way of living, and it's worth to be investigated by political science and philosophers.
Right. Well, yes, thanks for that question. Just a couple of responses to that. First of all, I can only talk about what I know. I don't want to, you know, and what anyone knows is limited. So I express my knowledge of what I know. But I'm not sure I would. Having said that, I'm not sure I would characterize, or at least I wouldn't characterize my view as showing a kind of linear movement in any ways from the ancient world to the world of modern democracy. In many ways, far from it. I mean, granted, what I've given you is only a sketch, an outline, but in many respects, the kind of politics that I have expressed here, given voice at various times in the ancient world, has been throughout much of human history highly endangered. It's been highly fragile and vulnerable to other forces. I talked about two of those forces today that represent problems for my view of politics: hyper-nationalism and kind of hyper-cosmopolitanism. This is our world. In other situations, in other contexts, and this is why I find thinkers like Al-Farabi and Maimonides so interesting, living in a very different kind of a medieval political culture in many ways. The obstacles to constitutional politics, constitutional government will be different. They may come from other sources. They may come from religion. They may come from different, as it were, nomos traditions in which communities are embedded. So I don't want to suggest. I hope I'm not leaving you with the suggestion that I'm providing some kind of linear movement from then to now. In fact, I feel are in fact quite the opposite. What I'm describing is highly it's fragile and endangered, and in many cultures in different times and places will put forward different obstacles. There was a lady in the back who wanted to.
Okay. Should we just take this one and then
Sure,
together?
yeah. She's had her hand up for a
Thank
while.
you.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, I'd like to say I really appreciate what your project in terms of kind of helping us reconceptualize the notion of political science.
Mhm.
I like the idea of what your project, and of course the idea of how you kind of position, so to speak, the notion of cosmopolitanism with this idea of nationalism, particularism, is somewhat problematic because it's kind of categorizing them in a way this is not seamless. This whole discourse on cosmopolitanism and nationalism is a much broader discourse, and it's not your topic, so I know you're not trivializing the complexities of that. But I'd like to know how, and by virtue of you mentioning a kind of litany of authors, kind of gives us the impression that it is kind of Eurocentric, but I know that that's not an exhaustive list that you gave us, but it's just kind of an example, and I appreciate that. What I'm interested in is how you, as a political scientist, now look at what's happening with the politics in the United States in terms of what you're dealing with in your project around the notion of reconceptualizing political science.
Well, a lot of my thoughts about this. Thanks for that question. A lot of my thoughts about this. I mean, it grown to some degree out of reflection, not just on American discourse, but on, I would say, to some degree also European discourse. And it seems to me, here's a very sort of sketchy answer to your thoughtful question, is that America has, to some degree, the difference between nationalism and cosmopolitanism, to some degree, and I will speak in very general terms here. You capture, I'm speaking, represents to some degree some of the differences between American politics and European politics today. I think American politics has at times threatened to become kind of hyper-nationalist in the way that was sort of attributed in some way to the Schmittian view. It's our way or the highway sort of thing. The world can be divided into friend and enemy. And then I think on the other side, the European view has become sort of committed to this kind of transnational cosmopolitanism. States don't matter, borders don't matter. We're all part of a kind of cosmopolitan identity. And I think that politics, as I understand it, in a way, is in a way neither of those. Or maybe to put it a slightly different way, each of those has an element within my understanding of the political, but neither should dominate. And that's why I've tried to stress that a legitimate polity has elements of both a certain kind of cosmopolitan commitment, but also commitment to its own particular traditions and local character and local customs. And it's a balance. It's a balance between those. And like any balance, it's always going to be to some degree unstable. It's not. You're never going to find the perfect, point of equilibrium. Things will always mix. But it must remain something of a balance between those. And when either one side or the other gets the upper hand, it threatens to become non-political in the way that I'm using that term. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Hi, thank you first of all for quite intriguing lecture. I found the question that you posed to us about political judgment really intriguing, and I thought that because I started wondering what would inform political judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the same instance, it got me thinking of what Aristotle said in the end of the Apology, where he said, worry about the matters of the soul and the matters of the state will take care of themselves. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, that's kind of contrary to the title of our lecture tonight.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really have a question, it's more of a point of clarification. How would you relate that part of the Apology to what we were talking about tonight?
Right. Thank you. That's a great question. And one of the things is you see, although it didn't, it to some degree touched a bit on what I talked about, the distinction between the good human being and the good citizen. I think what you find in both Plato and Aristotle, and what I think is in fact deeply important, is a genuine tension between the goods that we have as members of a society and the obligations we have as citizens, and what Plato and Aristotle both saw as, in some sense, what they believed was, in some sense, a kind of higher commitment to what they each called the philosophic life, the life devoted to thinking pure and simple. And you might say, as we might say, let the chips fall where they may. If they support your society, okay. If it doesn't, okay too. But your highest commitment being to the kind of principles of reason itself. And they were deeply aware and alive to that tension between the political and what we might call the political virtues and the intellectual virtues, the life of the citizen or statesman and the life of the philosopher. And it's not something they thought was ultimate, I believe, and I think also, is ultimately reconcilable. These do represent somewhat twin alternatives that we can pursue, or that are the highest alternative. What I've tried to focus on in the lecture was, in a way, the lower question, politics, not so much the higher order question of the best human life, or I was asked first, what is the best regime? I wanted to focus more on the question of the political, the moral and political virtues of human beings as we are situated in society. These may not be the highest virtues, they may not be what is best in us, but they are, for all practical purposes, good enough, and they make us, to some degree, who we are. They constitute a part of a worthy human life, and that's what I'd like to get across.
There's time for one more question?
Yes, sure. Please.
I'll take you.
Okay.
I'll take you back to the political judgment versus preferences.
Yeah.
And as we see in the last couple of decades, probably the preference part has gained force, and it's growing at a rapid pace.
Mm.
My two questions. Number one, it is driven by a political agenda and a political force behind it. Obviously, there is or correctly speaking, a political movement behind it. So can you define this political movement? And the second question is that if unchecked, where will this political movement take us in 50 years of time?
Maybe you have something more specific in mind. I don't see it in quite that way. I don't see it as a political movement per se, or with an agenda of its own. What I think of it is in many ways a movement that's driven increasingly by the imperatives of modern science. Maybe you might say science is a political agenda. I'm not as sure. But I think that the kind of political science of which I'd been critical is largely the attempt to turn, as I was describing, political science as focused on the questions of practical reason and judgment, to turn that into a kind of theoretical science whose concern is to elaborate the governing laws of human behavior. It's a somewhat different approach to the study of political life. Maybe within its own sphere it has its value and can be legitimate, but it is not the only, nor do I think it is the primary thing that the study of politics should be about. So I'm not so much what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not attributing to this some kind of sinister political agenda, but I think it's in large part, if it shows anything, it shows the kind of attempt to turn the study of politics into a kind of scientific study which by the nature of that discipline, by the nature of its methodology and the like, is not going to focus on the themes of judgment, practical reason, and deliberation to the same kind of degree that I think are important. I know maybe we're going too long, but I want to think the lady here has a question.
Thank you. It's just I have this controversy in my mind now about the idea of going back again to the idea of the particular and hyper-nationalism.
Right.
At the end, when you suggested a program, and when actually I look at the names you mentioned, it seems that all of them were really, they emanated from the particular, from hyper-nationalism. When we look at most of them, no one talked about the idea that we understand now as cosmopolitan or whatever. Maybe they taught some universal ideas that would match for everyone, but each one of them, looking at the historical moment he emanated from the particular. So what I'm suggesting is, if we make some alteration to the program you suggested, that why don't we say that each one or each political science department or whatever start from studying the particular, and actually, because when you said that politics is the science of making judgments, and also Amartya Sen said that development is to give people freedom to make choices or whatever. Freedom is emanating from what you have, from the particular. So I don't see any problem with the idea of particular. Maybe I go to the extreme to say why not hyper-nationalism, and that I don't see as versus cosmopolitanism or globalism. This is not this against that, but you should emanate from that. And actually, as you mentioned when you answered the gentleman there, you said that I said these names because this is the culture I emanate from. So you also emanate from the particular. So what I see is there's no problem with the idea of having a particular, and maybe we can alter the program to say that we should study the particular, and that may be the good way or a start to teach people how to make good political judgment.
You've stated it better than I did myself. What can I say? No, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. No, all moral and political reasoning begins from particulars, and that's right. That's exactly where we begin. And I think rather than and that in many ways is the best kind of introduction, I think, to political education. let's look at the kind of moral and political judgments particular individuals have made in particular situations. See what kind of reasoning, what kind of deliberation was open to them. What was it doesn't mean we endorse their views, but we have a sense of the kind of problems and issues facing statesmen and citizens in specific moments, and from that we can begin to develop a theory, as it were, of. But no, I love the way you put it. Thank you very much for that.
Just in wrapping up, can I just ask a question? Because I was very interested by the way you ended your lecture, talking about literature and your encouragement for us to read. And your list was, I'm sure, just a list of personal favorites, but there are others. I mean, Tolstoy and Henry James and Jane Austen. And so as I thought of my own list, I would have added George Eliot, and then so something like Daniel Deronda, which I'm sure somehow conforms to your idea. What you were telling us by encouraging us to read is somehow covered in a book like. But when you think of politics in regards to literature, when one talks about the politics of literature, one's talking about another thing, which is almost precisely the opposite, which is the way that something like George Eliot's Daniel Deronda is a product of the politics of the age, that is, the biases of the age, the prejudices, the conditioning of the particular period. So I suppose the question is do you agree that when one talks about the politics of literature now as these prejudices that condition the novel, that's not the same kind of politics that you're encouraging us to see and be taught by from reading literature?
Yes, no, the case of literature is in the case of, in many ways, philosophical figures. I'm not saying it to endorse necessarily one view of looking at it. My own interest, and you were talking earlier, professor of comparative literature. I only approach this as a political scientist looking at literature. What I'm particularly interested in are novels and stories dealing with that show both character and show some kind of thinking, deliberation, that shows some kind of moral deliberation. Because here, once again, you see something particular, and you see the way in which both thinking is shaped by character, and in some way character shapes thinking. And again, what is the study of politics to some degree, but the study of the ethos, as I tried to say, the ethos, the character of a person and people, how they are shaped by their way of life, and how they in turn help to shape it. And I think the great novelists help us with this. I don't know Eliot well, but I'm glad to include George Eliot in the future syllabus. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Anyways,
for that.
it was my
Thank
pleasure.
You for the
Thank you
lecture
very
and the
much.
debate.